when Francisco Varela proposed neurophenomenology, he proposed it as a remedy, not a solution to the hard problem of consciousness, right? Why did it choose that word? A remedy, he drew from, it's like a Wittgensteinian philosophical remedy. But remedy is, no, I reject your presuppositions. I reject this kind of Cartesian internalist assumptions or ontology you bring to the table. And I just say, I'm not gonna treat neural level as a privileged locus of causality. But what that means for reality in terms of ontology is that when you take a participatory epistemology, that goes hand in hand with a relational ontology, which goes hand in hand with this kind of ethical know-how, right? And Karen Barad, she uses this term ethico-onto-epistemology, right? When you understand reality like this, knowing, doing, and being are like that. You can't separate them. When you have that participatory realization, you realize that knower and the known are not separate. They have never been separate. That separation was always conventional, always empty.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Enactivism podcast. And today I have Hüseyin, which I met in the Netherlands at a workshop, and we hit off very, very quickly. We have a lot of overlap, and he's very, very smart. He's also very connected in kind of the circles that I'm embedded in. He's also a colleague of Raveki. He has published with him, and a lot of his work is very fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Tiago. Very happy to be here, man.
So let's start with a very quick introduction. So it's like in just 2 or 3 minutes, just a little bit about who you are and a bit about your kind of academic backgrounds and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Hüseyin, from Cyprus. I have been doing my PhD in the Netherlands at Leiden University for the past 5 years almost. Hopefully will be done by the end of this year. So looking forward to that. I am part of the PRISM lab. We study psychedelic, religious, self-transcendent, and mystical experiences. My initial background was in clinical medicine, but I quickly realized that that wasn't really for me. And I decided to dive deeply into cognitive science, especially the kind of philosophical aspects of cognitive science. And in my work, I very much try to always keep that at the core and have that as like a guiding principle, to always be mindful of the assumptions and presuppositions we bring to the table before we even get to start doing science. Yeah, my work specifically focuses on providing theoretical accounts of self-transcendent experiences and the ensuing transformation from inactive complex systems perspectives. And that also involves developing new theories and new methodologies to test these complex context-dependent phenomena. So yeah, that's my background in a gist.
Cool. Thanks a lot for that. And I find kind of like the pivot of your backgrounds really, really, really interesting. Was there like a specific thing that made you think, okay, I really need to change what I'm doing? Or was it like a slow realization of like, maybe I'm not where I'm supposed to be?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both, a mixture of both. I don't mind talking about this openly. I shared this with people before, and I think this is shared by a lot of people, a lot of researchers who find themselves in psychedelic research, where they are inspired by the experiences they have. And I had a similar story. This was after like my graduation in medical school. A friend suggested, "You wanna, try LSD with me?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." And I had my first experience. In retrospect, I didn't know the dose. I would imagine now that it was like 50 micrograms, so nothing, groundbreaking. But it was sufficient that it made me realize how little I knew and how limited my perspective and worldview have been until then. it kind of showed itself like a seed, and it just kept growing. And when I got back to Cyprus and started working as a general practitioner and preparing for the medical licensing exam, I just couldn't help but kind of fall deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole of philosophy and contemplative wisdom traditions and cognitive science. And instead of like, studying for the medical licensing exam, I just kept reading and reading. And I enjoyed the work. I enjoyed being a GP, but I realized within a year that I was really forcing it, that it was just wasn't my path. And I really quickly pivoted. Within a couple of months, I found a master's program, and yeah, I never looked back. And it's been 5 years, and that was one of the best decisions I've ever made, I would say.
Yeah, wonderful. And I love that. I respect that a lot. And I think that's one of the things that I love about the field of psychedelics in general, is because like so many people have like a very similar path. Like I think yours is maybe a little bit unusual because like you already had like such a set career like already, while some people discover it a bit early and then they're like, okay, this is what I'm doing. But I still find it tremendously funny and also interesting, where it's kind of like it just has this normativity to it of just like there's something here which you need to pay attention to, and this is more important than everything else, and then just like your whole life then gravitates towards it, and then you need philosophy to kind of navigate all of that. So yes, super cool background in kind of hearing your transition. So you've published quite a few papers recently, so maybe before we get into it, just give like a rough overview in terms of timeline of the papers you have published, but just very, very short, and then we'll dive deep into it, kind of knowing the overall landscape first.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, considering I've been, doing my PhD for 5 years, I published quite little because we struggled a lot with ethics and administrative aspects of doing psychedelic research, as a lot of people do. So I am yet to publish anything empirical. I hope to do that in the coming months. I'm already done with a couple of manuscripts about to submit. But so far, I have two publications, both theoretical. One with John Vervaeke and Daniel Mailing, and another one with Michiel van Elk, who is my current supervisor, and Julian Kieverstein, both for the same issue in philosophical psychology. It was a special issue on mystical entropy that both papers were published late last year, so November, December. And then there's another preprint out that we are currently revising for submitted to Phenomenology and Cognitive Sciences, which is on John's 4P model of knowing. And we kind of revised that 4P model through an inactive, non-dual, and reflexive perspective. So those are the publications out there so far.
Okay, awesome. So maybe let's start with the 4P model that you just mentioned, because as you know, this has also been massively influential for me, and also probably a lot of people on this podcast have a decent overlap with Vervaeke as well. Probably a lot of fans of his work here as well. So there's a decent degree of familiarity, but just in case there isn't, just to establish a little bit of the ground before we get into some other stuff. The average person, when they think of knowledge, they think of knowing facts, right? And so on this paper, and Vervaeke more broadly has always given kind of this concept of propositional theory. So maybe just unpack that a little bit, and what are the other ways of knowing that people are missing if they're stuck on this model?
Right. So John and his collaborators, mainly Christopher Mastropietro, have been developing this 4P model for the last decade or so. And the context for the development of this model was, as you said, exactly this, what John refers to as propositional tyranny in Western thinking. And I take that to be a kind of reification more broadly. It's a kind of a class of reification where people in their thinking overprivilege this very narrow understanding or aspect of knowing, which is, as you said, knowing facts, right? Like the capital of France is Paris, and cat has four legs. And I think this is a remnant of more recently positivism, rise of positivism, and trying to find the kind of established grounds for knowing in logic, essentially, which is very limited. And people have been, growingly critical of that. And John is certainly not the first person to point to non-propositional kind of knowing. Gilbert Ryle, Wittgenstein, Russell, embodied cognition traditions of like phenomenology. A lot of people have been in the last 50 years or so have been pointing to non-propositional kinds of knowing, even older than that. John's attempt was, I think, one of the few that really tried to systematize and create kind of a coherent whole, a coherent model of accounting for these different kinds of model. And so the 4P model clarifies or rather defines 4 different kinds of knowing. Propositional is the developmentally and evolutionarily most recent one. And it depends on more fundamental, more older kinds of knowing, namely procedural knowing, the know-how, skills, embodied habits, playing the piano, riding the bicycle, which in turn depends on perspectival knowing, what it is like to be in a state, the situational awareness of a given context where certain aspects of one's environment and one's bodily awareness is foregrounded and backgrounded and creates a salience landscape that allows for acting on that given environment, on those affordances, which in turn depends on the most fundamental kind of knowing, and this is the most ineffable one, rightfully so, which is participatory knowing, is knowing by being, that an autonomous, embodied living being in relating to, in participating with its environment, co-generates or co-identifies itself as a separate self and its world as a certain kind of world. And this is an ongoing process of participation that generates affordances or actionable patterns or aspects of one's environment, right? Because I'm a certain kind of being with a certain kind of bodily plan and I have opposable thumbs, right? Objects suddenly become graspable, but right, like if I was a lion, they will be completely different, right? There will be a different Umwelt, a different life world, because there is a different identity that is being enacted. So these are the kinds of 4 kinds of knowing that John and Chris supposes or offers in their model.
Yeah, awesome. That was a great breakdown. And one of the important elements of this kind of framework is also that these 4 ways, they're not like separate things, right? It's kind of like they kind of blend into each other. But one of the things that I would like you to maybe explore a little bit is, given that it's this continuum without fixed borders, like you can say that, okay, like these specific categorization that we're making, they're kind of like useful fictions, right? Maybe unpack that a little bit. What does that mean, like exactly? And then how do you deal, or how do you justify kind of within your model of, how are the categories justified if they don't have an objective border, and what does that mean about their ontology?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think this really already brings us to quite a deep territory about the foundations of knowing and being and reality that has very direct and deep impacts for the practice of science, and the questions about limits of science and an ontology for the practice of science in terms of like realism, anti-realism or perspectivism. And exactly in the paper, because we want to revise this model and bring some clarity to it, we offer 3 critiques, at least in the preprint version. That might change in the published version, hopefully. Let's see. But one of the questions is exactly like, how do these different kinds of quote unquote different kinds of knowing relate to one another, right? John offers this relationship of asymmetric dependence of these kinds of knowing. But does that mean that they're actually separate kinds of knowing? Like, are they, what is the nature of this distinction, right? Is it an ontological distinction? Are they uh, ontologically distinct entities or processes in the world? Or are they, as you say, just conventionally distinct, just useful fictions? And we draw from inactive cognitive science and Buddhist philosophy, specifically Yogacara epistemology and Madhyamaka philosophy, and make use of the notions of reflexivity and Madhyamaka two levels or two truth analysis. And essentially, the two truths analysis would say that we can understand reality in terms of conventional truths or conventional reality and ultimate truths and ultimate reality. Conventionally, there are differentiations, there are differences, there are distinctions, and we can participate or enact such distinctions without necessarily committing to any ultimate ontological distinctions in reality as such. From that perspective, all these different kinds of knowing are what we say non-logically identical. All kinds of knowing are participatory knowing, and they are kind of useful exaptive elaborations on this most foundational kind of knowing. That's, we can start from, for example, we can go to the conceive of life as it first evolved on this planet, right? And think of a very simple autopoietic, self-organizing, self-maintaining system, right? In separating itself from its environment, right? It was enacting participatory knowing. It was participating with its environment, and it was self-individuating. It was separating itself as a distinct being from its environment. And that act of being or becoming would entail a certain kind of knowing, namely participatory knowing, right? And then as life evolved and complexified, life kind of found through evolution by natural selection, found new ways of adapting to different contexts, different environments. And it made use of what was already there, right? It repurposed. That's how natural selection operates, right? It's not an inventor, it's a tinker, as naturalists would like to say. So comparable to, for example, tongue that evolved first for mastication and mixing food, and it was then repurposed or readapted or exapted is the word for it for speech. Participatory knowing was exapted to perspectival knowing, procedural knowing, and then finally in I would say human beings, but that's an open question whether other non-human beings are capable of procedural knowing, propositional knowing. Finally, in human beings, propositional knowing emerged. But when we go to an ultimate level of analysis, there is no kind of ontological distinction between these kinds of knowing. That always already in that background, participatory knowing is present. As long as a system is alive, right? As long as there's autonomy in that biological sense, participatory knowing is always ever present. And then these different kinds of knowing are just kind of like context dependent and observer relative, conventional expressions or manifestations of this foundational capacity of participatory knowing. So that kind of entails a sort of relational ontology or process relational ontology, I would say. And as it relates to philosophy of science, would be more compatible with a perspectival or participatory form of realism. That there is no, what science allows us to do through scientific knowing is not that we can, if we use the scientific method, we have direct access to objective truths about world that is independent of our perspective. Both our individual perspectives and our collective perspective embedded within epistemic communities as scientists, right, as knowers. But that the object, quote unquote, that is accessible through knowing and scientific knowing as a very specialized form of knowing is always context dependent and observer relative, right? It's always situated. The kind of perspectives we take or the kind of participation we enact always shapes the kind of knowledge that we will realize or we will enact. So I would say the looking at the four kinds of knowing would have these kinds of implications for ontology and philosophy of science.
Yeah, amazing. That was really well put. Now, when you mentioned that, especially when you give like this evolutionary perspective, when it's kind of like, the very basic animal, and then like other modes of knowing kind of build on top of it, that seems relatively straightforward to me. Taking that into account, what do you think that requires this kind of like Buddhist epistemology that you kind of draw from, that we can't get it otherwise?
Could you repeat that? I just want to make sure that I understand you correctly.
So if I understood correctly, you kind of employ all this Buddhist tradition in terms of epistemology to like try to explain a little bit of kind of like the how we should think ontologically about these categories. But then, if I understood correctly, you can also answer that question through kind of this evolutionary explanation that you tried to describe. So it's like, where do you think that there's a gap that then kind of justifies this extra backup? Let's say.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the notion of reflexivity comes to the foreground here. One useful distinction that I've been recently thinking about as it pertains to both therapy and pedagogy in its broader sense, right? Education, it can be religious, contemplative education, is the language of description versus language of training, right? And with this paper, we wanted to avoid performative contradiction, right? We wanted to use language and propositions to point beyond propositions, where propositions cannot take us. And towards the end of the paper, we engage in a practice we call reflexive unsaying, where we go through these different kinds of knowing and employ this Madhyamaka two truths analysis or two levels analysis and this notion of reflexivity, this practice of reflexivity, and we say, okay, here we are writing a paper as authors. You are the reader. You're reading this, right? These are propositions. There are distinctions to be made. They're useful. They're useful heuristics, right? There's a pragmatic bearing to them. They are helpful, but there's only so much that language or propositions can convey, right? Then you go beyond language, and then you arrive procedural knowing, right? And you realize already how limited or narrow language is, right? Like I can write you a very detailed description of how to ride a bike, and you can read it like excessively, and you will not learn how to ride a bike until you get on the bike and you fail and you go through the whole process, right? Similarly, as we move to perspectival knowing, like you will never know the experience of having a child, for example, until you go through that. You have those experiences, right? Because they transform you. And that transformation is really a shift in participatory knowing. So the point is that some truths, some knowledge about ourselves and our worlds is only accessible through non-propositional kinds of knowing, right? It's not like we cannot convey these kinds of knowing through language. So we wanted to use language in a reflexive manner and go through these like two levels of analysis and say, at conventional levels, these are all useful distinctions. We can use them. We can point to something, right? But we need to resist reification, right? The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon, right? Like the paper that we're writing, the language that we are using, it won't capture what we are pointing to. This is just a helpful heuristic that we can use to understand these different kinds of knowings as a remedy to what John referred to as propositional tyranny, or more broadly to reification. But ultimately, all of them will fail. All of them will fail, and this necessarily entails direct experiential realization of these truths, or of these aspects of reality that is not accessible through language. So Buddhism, or rather certain teachings or certain aspects or tools in Buddhist epistemology and philosophy, lend themselves quite well to this kind of thinking or this kind of practice, because really they have been developing this language of training for millennia, as has other traditions, right? I'm not saying that like these kind of two levels analysis is only unique to Buddhism. Other traditions have these kinds of tools as well. But because we are more familiar with the Buddhist aspects through inactive cognitive science, we kind of made use of that. But yeah, the same case is to be made for kind of Neoplatonic traditions and kind of downstream developments from that, whether that's in Christian mysticism or Sufi mysticism or Kabbalah. We can still see these kind of through lines across different traditions.
I see. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Taking all this context into account about the limitations of proposition, how do you think this kind of framework should frame how we approach therapy, and especially within the context of like, because now it's kind of funny because there's two, at least in my mind, how I tend to view it is that like there's two massive camps of therapy. One is kind of like, the old psychodynamic kind of like Freud inspired ish kind of branch of therapy. And then eventually we decided, well, that's not scientific, blah, blah, blah. And now kind of the gold standard according to science is kind of like CBT, and everyone just, it's almost equivalent to therapy nowadays. And so, but the other one was very, propositional in nature. Sometimes it could get a bit symbolic. It depends a little bit on the strand, but it was just talking things over basically. And now with CBT, it's completely different, like in a lot of ways from those older forms of therapy. To some degree, people often even conceptualize them as complete opposites, but it's still at the end of the day just talking things over, or at least talking it over with yourself at the bare minimum. So, how do you think we should, think about therapy, given everything we've been talking about the limits of propositions?
Right. Yeah. Another great question. I want to make it clear that propositional knowing is powerful, right? Language can be powerful. Look what we've accomplished through language, right? Through culture. But of course, as I've been saying, there are limits to it. And I think the limits of propositional knowing becomes very clear when we look at therapeutic transformation, right? Whether that's in a clinical context or in a contemplative context, right? Holding on to language, holding on to propositions, refining them, grasping them, I think will ultimately be a spur and get in the way of a deeper transformation. Being in a room and talking to a professional, to yourself, can be very powerful, right? It's a form of participatory sense making, where it's a form of self-transcendence in a way that affords going beyond your egocentric kind of biases and self-deceptive limitations, and hopefully kind of destabilize some of these propositionally accessible schemas that are maladaptive, that lead to suffering, right? To self-deceptive behavior. But I think because human mind is organized in such a way and functions in such a way that really revolves around these non-propositional kinds of knowing, the structures of psyche necessitates kind of tapping into or utilizing non-propositional knowing to catalyze, to bring about kind of lasting, deep personal transformation and collective transformation too. So when you look into alternative kinds of therapy that has been, growingly popular in clinical circles and also alternative circles like retreat centers, contemplative context, like dialogical practices, group settings, somatic embodied practices, psychedelic experiences, contemplative practices, more broadly what John refers to as kind of disruptive strategies, right? These kind of practices that are embedded in a ritual context like fasting, ecstatic dancing, that really kind of facilitates this letting go of propositions, letting go of that, like ungrasping the words that is immediately accessible to us, and going towards or making accessible deeper structures or processes or aspects of one's mind that are very kind of central to one's being in the world, one's identity, one's selfhood. And in turn, because of course, from inactive perspective and from a Buddhist perspective, self and world are always in relationship, right? Always dynamically co-emergent. When one goes through this transformation, the world is anew to them, right? There's a different world to be enacted, right? So that really has kind of not only epistemological implications, but understanding knowing in this way, in this participatory way, has also ontological and ethical implications, right? Because we are world makers together and individually, we can really participate in a different way to enact different worlds. So I would say these different kinds of methods really, hopefully, are in service of that.
Yeah, so obviously I'm very on board with that, but just a little tangents that I would like to explore out of my own curiosity, because you might be more familiar with this literature than I am. So obviously, in principle, these kinds of therapies, alternative therapies are very worthwhile. But at the same time, from my experience, they're also very enmeshed in woo-woo, and they're very guru-driven. And a lot of times, there's no empirical evidence whatsoever. People are just coming up with whatever they want. So let's say someone is watching this and they're struggling with whatever they might be struggling, and they know maybe they have tried some kinds of talk therapy, and now they listen to this conversation. They're like, oh, maybe that's the issue, right? Maybe I need something else. But I also don't want to get into like some woo-woo therapy that some random guy just came up in half an hour. So like, how do you think people can make the distinction? Like, of all those forms of alternative therapy, which ones do you think have the most solid footing in empirical research?
It's really hard to tell, because again, it kind of brings us about to the limitations of science, right? And limitations or challenges with empirical threads of scientific practice, right? For example, when we look at the biomedical framework, right, which is the kind of the de facto dominant paradigm that we use to evaluate the efficacy and effectiveness of a given intervention or therapeutic modality, we already see very serious shortcomings, and limitations, right? Like for example, the golden paradigm of the golden standard of the biomedical paradigm, the randomized control trials, makes a certain assumptions about data, about causality that are really quite problematic and really limits the kinds of phenomena that is knowable through these methods. So then, when I initially, of course, as you know, as a scientist, as a trained scientist, and of course, scientists under training still, I always had this inclination also of like, okay, like evidence-based therapy, right? We need like evidence-based therapy. We need good evidence. We need solid evidence to actually justify the safety, the feasibility, the efficacy of an intervention. But then I started thinking, as I dive deeper into an active approach and complex systems, I realized, yeah, but what are the presuppositions or assumptions made by these paradigms, by these perspectives, these methods? And I realized that yes, they can be useful, this evidence, but also we need to be quite critical about their limits and what they can and cannot say us. So I am, as of now, more inclined towards idiographic perspective, where like it's more kind of looking into or studying interventions. We should be more personalized and person specific in our approach, right? Always taking a step back, both in time and space, and looking at each individual uh, in a given context and saying, okay, this person has a certain background, right? Has a certain history, has certain intentions, embedded in a certain community, a cultural structure. What kind of interventions would be effective for this person and would be safe for this person, right? Because I can make the assumption that, like, psychedelic experiences can be powerful for a lot of people, but also for a lot of people with certain predispositions, with certain sensitivities, could be as easily, traumatic. This can be said for any intervention. But I also understand that this kind of approach, again, kind of opens the door or creates additional vulnerabilities to this kind of woo-woo, right? To the kind of people that would exploit or that would manipulate. And I think that's really a balancing act. Like as scientists, as clinicians, as therapists, we need to balance this idiographic, person-specific aspect of the phenomena that we are trying to understand, and ultimately, predict and kind of change or intervene in a way, but also focus on the kind of nomothetic aspects of it, like the universal principle law-like aspects of it, and find the middle ground where we can still, at a given context, have a certain set of principles that would allow us to kind of build guardrails against these kind of parasitic, manipulative, exploitative constraints or influences, while at the same time being still allowing us to be flexible and context sensitive. I don't really have the answers, right? Like my work is really devoted to this kind of balancing act. And we are kind of realizing what works and what doesn't work. One last thing for me personally, right? And this is also very difficult to kind of scientifically communicate, is really kind of interacting with the people that are kind of behind these ideas, right? Or that are responsible for facilitating such interventions, right? That are caregivers for people. I think if one meets these people, and although they're impressed by their ideas, there is a certain impression that perhaps these people are not really interested in embodying these ideas, right? And they can talk the talk, but they're not really readily able to or interested in walking the walk, let's say. Then that is already a warning sign for me that perhaps there might be some kind of exploitative dynamics that can emerge there. But of course, it's hard to tell. Not everyone is kind of equipped to be mindful of these signs, right? People are desperate. People are in need. They're vulnerable. That's why they seek help, and that's what makes them vulnerable to such dynamics, such people, such influences in the first place. So I think this also, yeah, like we need to have these kind of guardrails at higher kind of institutional levels to protect vulnerable populations from these, harmful influences.
What comes the most to mind to me is that I think the problem isn't just like fraud per se, which is like how you framed it. I think there's a bigger epistemological issue, and I'm really interested in this whole topic of this idiographic science you talk about, and maybe we can talk about reflexivity here as well as a related concept. But like the issue is, I kind of understand the criticism, but at the same time, what comes the most to mind when thinking about this is to come back to the Steelman argument for randomized controlled trials, where like there's a really, really good reason like why they exist. And what I find often a little bit problematic when I've talked with you in the past and when you mention this type of approach is like how exactly do you do that kind of balancing act? Because the issue is at the end of the day, what we want to know in a basic sense is, I mean, I'm oversimplifying this to death, but at the very least, we want to say, does this work? Right? Let's not have a person commit, I don't know, thousands of dollars potentially. And again, let's consider this purely from a non-fraud perspective. Like maybe it costs thousands of dollars because it takes, dozens of hours and very expertise, personnel and so on and so forth, right? So let's take the best case scenario. How can we know if that's going to work? Now, the issue is when you say, okay, depends on the person, depends on the context. Okay, but the issue is, that is combinatorially explosive, right? Like there's no way to account for that. And that's one of the reasons why we deal with averages despite how limiting they are. And also the fact that not only there's tons of variables, but then they also become confounding variables, right? It's like, what exactly is the cause here, right? That's the whole point of this kind of methodology. So how can we solve that? And I'm going to give you also a specific example, which is when I was very young, many years ago, I was really into fitness when I was kind of a teenager. And I used to watch this guy called like Elliot Hulse because, back then YouTube was very small and he gave like strength training advice and powerlifting advice and stuff like that. And then he got into this weird rabbit hole of like emotional, therapy like things where he would just like scream his lungs out and do all kinds of weird. And I'm like, this is woohoo for sure. Like something is off here. But I think he's being genuine. Like I don't think he was trying to deceive people. Now the question is, how can we tell, right? So like let's assume best case scenario, like okay, we need to have this individualized approach. Let's not rely on averages. But how exactly can we do that? How can we make the statement, not the statement, but this evaluation of whatever the hell this Elliot Hulse guy is doing, does this work or not?
Yeah, I mean, I also want to be clear here, like, as I was referring earlier, like this kind of balancing act, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, I think nomothetic approaches still have a place in cognitive science, in psychology, and in medicine. But I think we need to be mindful of their limitations. Maybe one useful way of seeing this is kind of looking at this assumption of ergodicity, right? In the past, I mentioned this with you, like we talked about this briefly. So for those of you, those of the people listening to this not familiar, ergodicity is a kind of remnant of statistical physics that was smuggled in by early psychology as psychology was trying to establish itself as a science, as a discipline. It borrowed a lot from the methodology of classical physics, right? And in classical physical systems, ergodicity very much applies, right? Like, for example, we can think of a fair die. And if this fair die is an ergodic system, the group average or the ensemble average and the time average of that system is non-arbitrarily similar, meaning that if I throw a dice 100 times, and if I throw 100 dice one times, and I take the average, they will be very similar, right? But this makes the assumption that such systems are quote unquote memorylessness, right? Historicity doesn't play a role here. Like the system doesn't learn about its past interactions, which we know to be false for complex adaptive systems for human beings, right? Because we learn. I mean, even the act of testing someone, unless you do it unknowingly, will change that person, right? Over time. So when we make this assumption in our methods, and statistical methods very much assume this, we really miss a lot of the richness in the data that we would normally label noise, but is actually signal, right? A lot of non-stationary, non-linear patterns in the data. But also at the same time, it wouldn't be accurate to say all phenomena, all human phenomena that we study in cognitive science and psychology is non-ergodic, right? That it violates this, they violate this ergodicity assumption. Eiko Fried, who's a professor at Leiden University, clinical psychology, he has this brief comment that he published with a colleague that he kind of offers that maybe ergodicity is also on a continuum. And I resonate with that. I think, for example, when we look at somatic disorders, right? When we look at neural disorders, right? One could say that the context sensitivity or the person specificity of such disorders is at a lower scale, right? So it's more ergodic in that sense. So it's more amenable to nomothetic research than more complex phenomena such as psychiatric disorders. Because psychiatric disorders involve just scales and scales of complexity, right? They're social phenomena, they're existential phenomena, they deeply enmesh with the selfhood of a person, right? All these constraints, all these kind of causal patterns in the world become enmeshed, right? So then these phenomena become deeply context sensitive and person specific. So then when we take these randomized control trials and these same set of assumptions, and we apply it uncritically to all kinds of phenomena that we are studying, we really don't do justice to them. So then we really may have to like have this balancing act and say, okay, like we can kind of, as we keep studying this, we can have these sets of principles that at a given context can guide us in our choices of methodology, right? What am I studying here? What am I interested here? Given my goals, given my aims, right? In some contexts, statistics are perfectly fine. Averages are very informative, but in other contexts, they are very, very limiting, right? And this is a testament to the replication crisis that we are seeing in psychology, perhaps, that we our uncritical adoption of these methodologies are really becoming a spur to us, a hurdle to us. So I am definitely of the opinion that we should kind of, develop these principles that guides us in a case-by-case basis, whether we are doing research, whether we are testing the efficacy, feasibility of an intervention, or whether we are treating someone, right? That some modalities are near universal, right? Like paracetamol, right? Paracetamol is effective for most people, if not all people, right? Because the phenomena that we are intervening is a local phenomena of a lower scale complexity, right? But when we look at depression, it's so complex, it's so context sensitive that one can even say, what is depression, right? What does this label apply to? And like, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, like, are they effective? Are they not? I don't know. They're effective for a bunch of people, and they're harmful to others. So again, like it really brings us to this kind of continuum and this case by case basis, and that very much links into reflexivity, and we can kind of dive into that if you're interested later on. But yeah, that would be my response. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. That was very good, and it's a lot more clearer now. So yeah, I would love to talk a little bit about reflexivity and how all of this kind of relates to that, and also just as a final touch point on this notion of idiographic science as well. Maybe it would be nice to give kind of an example of like a specific study of how you'd go about doing this. And if I remember correctly, maybe I might be misrepresenting this slightly, but I remember when we were talking about back in the Netherlands, I believe that you were doing some research where you were trying to apply some of these principles of like let's take the experience as it is for the individual and not let's not worry about all these statistics and group averages and whatnot. So I think giving like a very specific example of like how can we conduct this type of research, and also what are the trade-offs that we're making, and the pros and cons compared to more traditional methodology. How does that look like?
I collected some data. I just finalized it. The last participant answered her questions a couple of weeks ago. And I collected experience sampling data, time series data, from 15 participants attending legal psychedelic retreats in the Netherlands. And I started tracking them 2 days before, and I continued tracking them 3 months after the retreat. And they answered personalized items. So the themes, the variables were shared across people, but I meet them before we started the study, and I asked them, how would you like to phrase this so it's relevant to you, so you can relate to it as deeply as possible, right? So people would exactly know what the item means, right? This is kind of stepping beyond some of the limitations of standardized questionnaires. And people answer these items every day using a visual analog scale on an app. And then I have these, 105 observation time points, which I applied some complex systems tools developed by some people, including my collaborator, Fred Hasselman at Radboud. And then I can see a lot of different metrics of complexity of what is called early warning signals as people approach phase transitions. And I could see in most of the participants that people in most of their variables show these sudden non-stationary transitions in their means, right? They start at like a lower level, and immediately after the retreat, most participants show this kind of destabilization where complexity metrics kind of peak. The fluctuation in their time series data peak kind of preceding the retreat, during the retreat, and immediately after the retreat, which is followed by this kind of phase transition where, like, for example, like the meaning in life before the retreat was kind of mid-level, and it just goes up to a higher level. And in some of the people, it remains there for the rest of the study, right? That tells me something about this kind of potential enduring transformation that may follow after the retreat. And if I use statistical methods, I would lose this non-stationary shift in the mean, right? That very much differs in how it manifests across people. So one of the mottos that Fred likes to talk about is, instead of aggregating and then analyzing, as in nomothetic approaches, group level statistics, you analyze individuals and then you aggregate. So what I do is that I analyze all these people, all this data, and then I apply principal component analysis, right, to all of their time series data individually, and I derive a single principal component per person that captures the greatest amount of variance, right? It's like the common theme that unifies all these. And then I can use those at group level statistics. So I capture as much of the individual variability at the individual level, and then I can still look at the group level commonalities. Similarly, another thing is, instead of focusing on the content, right, at the group level, I can focus on the dynamics, right? I wouldn't be comfortable saying psychedelics increase meaning in life, right? They may or they may not. But another, perhaps more idiographic way of looking at it is that dynamics of change that people express following these experiences show a lot of commonalities, right? So that common ground, and there's a paper about that by Fred and some of his co-authors. Merlin Olthoff is the principal author, called Best of Both Worlds, right? Best of idiographic and nomothetic. right? How can we capture this person's specificity, context dependence, while at the same time looking for universal laws, right? Looking for principles. And I think dynamics of change is a better candidate for a principle than saying psychedelics increase meaning in life or psychedelics treat depression. So that's in practice how these kinds of research can be implemented.
Amazing. That was really really good. That was super clear now, and I think you made such a good argument for it. That was wonderful. Um, okay, so now you also did another paper about the cognitive continuum again, something Vervaeke has been talking for quite a long time. So let's unpack that a little bit, explain a little bit to the audience. So why explain a little bit of the concept and why are you trying to connect flow and mystical experiences?
Very nice. Great transition also, right? Because the empirical stuff that I have just been talking about is directly testing the predictions from that theoretical paper. And it's a bit preliminary, but I'm very happy with the results that we observed because like the theory really is really deeply aligned with the observations that we made through the study. But of course, it's very early at this point. So, like you said, John developed cognitive continuum with another colleague, initially Daniel Craig, and they were planning to publish a book on it. Never worked out. Some aspects of it has been published in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, the first book of the series that was co-authored with Christopher Mastropietro. So, cognitive continuum is a model or a framework for understanding self-transcendent experiences and the potentially ensuing transformation following these experiences or from these experiences by kind of placing them on this continuum and understanding them as greater instantiations or expressions for a capacity for relevance realization. And what we did in this paper is we use, again, tools from inactive approach and tools from complex systems to kind of ground it more in the current state of affairs in cognitive science, both more broadly in active cognitive science, but also work in self-transcendence, work in psychological change from complex systems, work of Fred Hasselman and other people, like the so-called early warning signals, entropic brain hypothesis in psychedelic research. And now we kind of understand this continuum to represent a local to global continuum, right? Local in the sense of the local organization of the system. And the system is not necessarily just the brain, right? Again, this is from inactive perspective. We understand the proper unit of analysis for this phenomena or for any cognitive phenomena to be the person in their world, right? The person embedded in their world. So it's, again, very much relational, very much participatory. So what's happening in these states, starting from fluency to insight to flow to mystical experiences and to transformation, is from organizationally at local levels of organization and temporally, right? There is a shift from local to global, and all these states or all these processes instantiate these cycles of destabilization, right? Breaking down of rigid constraints, defining one's patterns of relevance realization or sense making, because sense making is like the inactive counterpart of relevance realization, the stabilization of these patterns, and a context dependent destabilization or reorganization that hopefully or that may kind of facilitate transformation. Not necessarily so, right? The work of Merlin Althoff with Fred Hasselman already shows this, where people show these destabilizations, right, as they go through the therapeutic process and they go through phase transitions. But sometimes the attractor is so heavy, right? It's so powerful that people just fall back into the maladaptive habits again, maladaptive patterns of relevance realization again, right? So context at that vulnerable state, that destabilizing state is very, very crucial to the point that the therapeutic or the transformative effects of these states cannot be attributed to the induction methods themselves, right? Psychedelics are not transformative, right? Lived experiences in a given context, that's what transformation needs or entails or derives from. So then all these states or processes share this through line of destabilization and reorganization of relevance realization, the capacity for relevance realization from local to global that affords greater and greater insight, right? Not only because with flow or with insight, right, you can say it's domain specific, right? I'm working on a mathematics problem and I get this insight, this aha, there is some reorganization happening that allows me to fit my environment, that task context more optimally, right? But it won't make me a better person, right? It won't make me suffer less. But in a mystical experience, because that level of organization is more global, that insight is domain general, right? It's systemic. So it allows me to fit my world in a more, right? This is from Merleau-Ponty, the optimal grip, right? You optimally grip your world in a way that it's conducive to attunement, right? To personal development, to better mental health, to greater meaning in life, to greater levels of belonging, just flourishing more broadly. And yeah, by supplementing cognitive continuum with inactive tools and complex systems ideas, we also make it empirically testable, right? Because how do we operationalize this change in relevance realization? How do we operationalize this change in sense making? And we do it through these kinds of complex systems tools, right? Applying it to time series data, not just experience sampling, but it can be neural data, physiological data, because you see it in like across the system, right? You don't just see it at experience level, right? You see it at embodied levels too, at even social levels, right? So a future project that we are working on, hopefully for a postdoc, does exactly that and kind of embeds the whole kind of framework in neurophenomenological paradigm. Like how can we bridge lived experience, rich lived experience with rich third person data, whether that's neural data, physiological data, movement data, and we can capture these dynamics, these kind of cycles of destabilization and restabilization in a context so we can learn more about what makes a context transformative versus traumatic for a given person, right? So we can start developing these principles so that can inform us developing such context for transformative change, for contemplative development, let's say.
Awesome. Yeah, that was really in depth. And maybe some people maybe it might be best to explain in just a little bit what relevance realization means in case people got lost a little bit. But after that, I would also love for you to explain then how does this relate to this entropy and fluency hypothesis continuum as well.
So relevance realization is a theory, a framework developed by John in response to the problem of relevance or frame problem, which has been kind of being shaped or formulated in cognitive science and in artificial intelligence circles. People like Dan Dennett, Murray Shanahan, Fodor even kind of touched on it. Jerry Fodor touched on it briefly. Has been kind of trying to articulate, right? Like what makes autonomous systems different than heteronomous machines, right? Even the current large language models, right? What is the mark of cognition, right? What process, once possessed, makes a system properly minded? And John's response to that is relevance realization. That by maintaining several trade-offs at multiple scales of organization, a system, it realizes relevance in a given environment, right? It kind of fits in its environment and separates what is relevant for its survival from what is irrelevant for its survival, right? So there's an adaptive function to it because the reality is so complex, so combinatorially explosive that you need to take the large world of reality and you need to make it into a small world that affords adaptive, goal-oriented, survival-oriented functioning, right? And that's what relevance realization is. It allows the organism to frame its world in such a way that kind of realizes or leads to emergence of adaptive affordances. So then the organism can act on these affordances to maintain its autonomy, right? To maintain its selfhood, let's say. And sense making very much attempts to address the same question, but from a different perspective, right? So the inactive theorists weren't really interested in the framing problem, but they were interested in exactly this, like, what is cognition? Like, how do living system on the principle or on the basis of their organizations, can actually relate to their worlds or evaluate their worlds or make sense of their worlds in this adaptive manner, so that some aspects of the world emerges as good, right? Yum. And some aspects emerges as bad, harmful, yuck. And then there is this approach avoidance stance going on, right? And of course, there is much complexity to this when it comes to human beings, because we are not just survival oriented, right? But that's the gist of it. And then how entropy comes into it. So entropic brain hypothesis proposed in, what was it, 2013 initially, I think, and then 2018 there was another paper, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken about the first paper. Was kind of like a framework to attempting to kind of make sense of the findings, especially the findings with regards to application of certain complexity metrics to brain data, to neural data, mainly entropy. The initial observations was that acute psychedelic state can be characterized by loosely constrained states where it's disorganized, it's unpredictable, it's more complex, it's more disordered. Entropy is a metric to characterize such processes, right? Entropy is a very messy metric. It has been used by a lot of people in a lot of different disciplines, from thermodynamics to information theory. And that's one of the criticisms repeatedly brought forward by people in the field, that like we need to use these metrics in a critical way, in a consistent way, in a systematic way, and not just like, okay, I'll just keep applying entropy until I derive statistically significant results, right? But there's still something to it. It still captures something. So our attempt was, okay, let's perhaps recover this useful aspect of entropy by taking a step back and looking at it more broadly from this inactive relevance realization, complex systems perspective. So we understand entropy as an index or a metric of destabilization, right? So when the organization of a system becomes loose, when the constraints defining its organization becomes loose, right? Things start moving, right? Like it's in moving, it's in disorder, things are shifting, more fluctuation. This is reflected in experience, right? During these experiences, it's very labile, right? You cry one moment, you're happy the next moment. And also, even following these experiences, right? There's still this destabilization going on, and it depends on person from person. Some people restabilize more quickly, but there's really this unpredictability happening, right? Like it's not stable. Things are not gelled. Things are not concrete, let's say. But also, entropy is just one side of the spectrum, or one side of the coin, right? Necessarily, this destabilization, this organization, is followed by reorganization. So then we say, what can be an index for that reorganization? And of course, we say that's fluency, right? Fluency, both the lived fluency or the felt fluency, where like things are, there is this sense of ease, right? Like when you're reading a book, you read it before and you're familiar with it, there is just ease to it, right? And if you enjoy it, especially, it just feels good. There is a smoothness to it. And this sense of fluency oftentimes is experienced during the acute experience, but also following the experience, right? So entropy and fluency, and that's where the entropy fluency hypothesis comes from, can be used to characterize this cycle of organization, as the cycle of destabilization and restabilization, and can be used to operationalize this cycle of change that characterizes self-transcendent experiences, both in the acute state and in the post-acute kind of integration or transformative state. So yeah, I hope that was clear enough.
Yeah, that was great. Just something that is coming to mind regarding kind of this notion of fluency. I really like it, but at the same time, like especially when you're thinking about it in these terms of like lack of friction, which like something just works. There's an element of it which is deeply pragmatic, right? So like something like works, right? There's no friction. But at the same time, there's also these aspects where a lot of times fluency is a matter of like either a letting go of reflexivity. So like for example, but it's not the perfect analogy, but something that's coming to mind now is kind of like Heidegger's notion of the day, for example, right? Like you're very like everything is smooth when you're losing yourself, to the other. But there's also other things, right? So, for example, when you have oversimplified models of reality, right? It's like it's very fluent, but at the same time, that's not where the most adaptive place is to be. So how do you take this into account in this model of fluency?
That's another great point. That's the whole context dependence aspect, right? Like when we talk about transformation later in the paper, we really talk about like this organization is constitutively context dependent, right? Like context is not this. So like when I use the word context dependent or embedded, I don't say that like we are just like plopped into the world. I'm saying that like the world and we are enmeshed with the world, right? Like the context that we are in is constitutive of our organization, of our development. So fluency, as you say, may just as easily be maladaptive in a given context, right? There are studies on false insights. There are studies in senses of false fluency. One example that could be given is this whole notion of conspirituality, right? Where like people, and this is so common now because of like, of course, access to malinformation, sorry, disinformation and misinformation, and people get these simplified models of reality, and it makes sense, and it allows them to seemingly explain so much, but it's deceptive, right? It's an illusion, and it really, especially in the long run, it's maladaptive. It untethers them from our lived experience. It untethers them from our lived reality. So that's really a testament to the context-dependent nature of relevance realization or sense making, right? What is relevant at a given context may be relevant for a brief period of time, but it can just be, maladaptive shortly after that. And this rigidity, this grasping, this holding onto it can really lead to maladaptive patterns, can really lead to suffering in contemplative traditions, right? We talk about spiritual bypassing, spiritual narcissism. Certain experiences can, given the improperly supportive context, instead of leading to properly self-transcendent experiences, they can lead to destabilization in the sense of dissociation, depersonalization, derealization, right? So when we say that like fluency is the good part of it, right? Entropy is disorder, fluency is order. That order is always normatively charged in a context-dependent way, right? It really depends whether it's good or not, the given context.
Right, but the issue that comes to mind, and what I'm gonna say, like applies a lot to myself as well, because like I'm very on boards with kind of this kind of framework that you're presenting, of being context dependent and whatnot. But and I also really like how you always try to present this in a very pragmatic way. Like, is this functional? Is this dysfunctional? The problem that comes to mind, though, that I ask myself when I also put it in those terms, though, is that okay? But if it's so context dependent, if it's so pragmatically oriented, and then you have to evaluate that criteria, like you have to make a judgment. But that judgment, which is ultimately what your decision depends on, that's not part of the framework. So a lot of times I wonder to myself, okay, I'm saying it's context depends. I'm saying all this like adaptivity talk, but because of that, then I'm actually not saying much of anything. Like I'm not I'm saying, okay, to then make this final judgment, which is kind of what we care about. Okay, then it depends on something else, and I can't tell you what that something else is, right? So it feels like I'm always afraid of trapping myself in this system of like hyper specialization, and of saying, okay, it always depends, it's always individual. But then it's like, okay, then how do we know? And then I'm gonna say, well, it depends on this other stuff, right? It's just like, well, the other stuff is what we want.
Yeah, no, that's again really well said. That's the whole balancing act between idiographic and nomothetic, right? Like again, it's really the dynamics, right? It's this cycle that is law-like, right? That is universal, and not perhaps the outcome of it, right? We are trying to provide a principle of organization for such dynamics that, in a context-dependent manner, may or may not lead to positive outcomes. And it also brings, for me at least, brings to the foreground the crucial nature of reflexivity, right? if everything is context dependent, it's all of this is conventional, there is no ultimate grounding, right? The inactive approach uses the notion of groundlessness from Madhyamaka. Then what is the anchoring point here? Like what are we orienting ourselves toward? Or, like how can we make any evaluative judgment? How can we make any judgment of truth? And I think that to me necessitates that this kind of science is done in a way that embraces reflexivity, not only philosophically, right, but also methodologically. That as researchers embedded in epistemic communities, right, we can never do science alone. We can never do anything alone, if you ask me. But as scientists embedded in communities, we really need to counterbalance each other and always have the certain guardrails, certain guidelines, certain methodologies or practices in place that always reminds us, okay, I'm studying this phenomena right now, right? And I'm using this tool right now, and it's useful in this context, right? But I shouldn't hold on to it because it's groundless, right? It's conventional useful, but it can as easily be harmful in a different context. So how do I always remind myself of this pragmatic orientation, this perspective that I'm maintaining, that I'm enacting right now with other people, right? How can I always be mindful of? How can I resist this view from nowhere, this grasping, this kind of breaking that strange loop that we find ourselves in, and always come back to the perspective, always come back to what are my intentions here? What are my aims here, right? Because to me, that's really an antidote for reification. And it's also a reminder, right, that this groundlessness does not entail an anti-realism. It does not entail a relativism. It does not entail nihilism, but it entails that we are active participants in our world. And as scientists, right, we have a say in how our phenomena of interest appear to us, right? Because the kind of tools, the kind of questions we ask necessarily shape the kind of phenomena we observe, right? So that to me is a practice of humility and a practice that reminds me of my agency with other people, that we can work together and we can really, not only as researchers, but with participants, right? In my work, I also strive towards citizen science, right? Because participants are not just like passive receptives of like receptacles of data, right? Like they have a say, like like they are active participants in that. So creating this kind of a milieu, this kind of setting really allows us to be active agents that kind of maintains that balance between a kind of radical constructivism that is all social, there is no grounding, everything goes, and then a rigid fundamentalism that oh, it's one thing, and I use the right method, and it gets me there, and then I can anchor my judgments about reality. I think a participatory relational commitment necessitates a shift in the pragmatics, the praxis of how we do science, right? It's not just in the theory, it's really always this embodied reminder, a call to action of like, okay, but what does this mean for me as a scientist, right? How do I need to go through transformation. I need to shift my perspective and always realize it's just a perspective, right? Hence the name inactive approach. I never use it in activism, right? It's inactive approach because it's just an approach, right? It's just useful in this context. If it's not useful, I should stop using it. I shouldn't be dogmatic about it. So I don't know, maybe that kind of addresses some of your concerns.
Yeah, that was great. I think that's a really good take on how to approach it. Now, in regards to this notion of perspective, which is also very related to this notion of assumptions and methodology as well. Throughout this conversation, we've talked about psychedelics very often, and we've talked it in a way that I really like, which is actually recognize them as really, really important and very insightful for various reasons, but at the same time, always grounding them into human experience that is everyday life, right? Like these two things are not completely independent, and I think that's the way to best think about them. So taking that into account now, this notion of methodology with perspective, with limitations, what do you think are the biggest problems right now with psychedelic science? So regarding all these assumptions, all these perspectives, what is the perspective that it is missing in the field?
Okay. I would say that although even since I started, right, it's been 5 years, psychedelic research, like the revival of it is already very young, right? But even within such a short time, there has been considerable steps forward, right? Forward towards really embracing this context dependence, to reflect that in methodology, to bring back the experience, the lived experience to the center of cognitive science where it belongs, right? But still, the cognitivist or representational or reductionistic attraction or pull is really strong, right? We have an escape velocity, right? Whether that's an inactive escape velocity or a complex systems escape velocity, but not everyone is like gaining that velocity, that momentum to just like escape the hold of this, because like people are brilliant. They want to do good science. They're kind people. There are of course some bad apples out there that applies. We are human beings. We are imperfect, but they want to do good science. But there's such the incentive landscape is such, the system, the structural constraints are such that it really makes it hard to do this kind of science, right? It just reinforces the more of the same, the wisdom of the masses, if you may, right? Like, oh, I'm just gonna do what my supervisor has been doing. I'm just gonna do what the popular guy in the field has been doing, right? And that is doing lab-based studies, randomized control trials, very much neurocentric. Even though you say I'm gonna embrace complexity, right? You still that means that like I'm gonna apply complexity metrics to the brain. And we talked about this. Fred talks about this weak complexity or weak commitment to complexity and strong commitment, right? If you really strongly commit to complexity, that means that reality is organized in such a way that there are no essences, right? There is nothing intrinsic here. It's always in flow. It's always context dependent. It's always interdependent, right? How do I study that? What should my methodology be, right? What kind of assumptions should I make so that I can capture this complexity? Not just saying brain is a complex system and applying entropy, but really going beyond the brain, right? Going beyond the lab. And I'm not saying that we should just do away with neural data. We should just do away with lab-based studies, but really we need to supplement these dominant perspectives, and we need to supplement and complement them with more idiographic approaches, more ecologically valid approaches. And always, I think this goes beyond supplementation for me, that if we are studying experience, reflexivity should always be there, right? Reflexivity, like these practices. For example, Evan Thompson, in a chapter that he published as part of his book, edited by Dave McMahon and some other people on science and Buddhism, he talks about the cognitive science of mindfulness meditation, right? Self-transcendent experiences, which is very much related to psychedelic experiences. But this applies to any experience that if we want to do justice to the cognitive scientific study of such experiences, right, we need to methodologically embrace reflexivity and have, for example, a lab life ethnographer and a sociologist of science in the lab, right? Like we do science and then people are studying us doing science, like this kind of meta science, right? What is the assumptions that we bring to the table, right? The life world is always there, right? I think of it almost like, life comes out of ocean, right? And then the salt water is in our cells. Like there's no escape from it. We are always embedded beings. And how do we honor that? And as I speak these things, I realize it's very hard to implement these. Like it will be very hard to like convince people with money, like founders of like, hey, I need more people. I need I need someone to study me as I'm doing science. But it really, for me, it's a must. And in my work, more and more people I work with, especially like Daniel Mailing and John is also very much on board with this, I believe. Like always, in the least, include a section of reflexivity at the end of your paper, right? Like what is your perspective, right? Just kind of practice of humility that opens the ground for bridging, for integration, so we can just stop with this fragmentation, this kind of silo thinking. in science, but more broadly in kind of in the westernized world. So that's that would what I would say.
I love that. That was so good. Now, in terms of this talk about limitations of neuroscience, like a really big one that you mentioned many times throughout is again this notion of the mind has self-contained in the brain, right? And therefore, it doesn't include the body, it doesn't include situations, it doesn't include the environment, and so on and so forth. You've unpacked a lot of that. But another element that I think neuroscience really suffers from is this like very hardcore hypermaterialism, where it's not just the conceptualization of where does cognition start and ends in the sense of like speciality, but also the very causation of that cognition as well. I think that's actually, I mean, the whole issue of environment is actually huge, but I actually think that this is even a bigger problem because, at least in my opinion, it has. I mean, this is hard to compare them because they're both so important. But my intuition is that this has even more existential import, right? So, from this perspective of the actual causal role of the brain and how does that interact with our phenomenology in the sense of being an inactive agent, what can cognitive science offer to try to counter this neuroreduction of the person to just the brain?
Another great question. Well, I already kind of touched on this. One step would be to be critical, to be mindful of the assumptions we bring to the table when we design studies, right? When we design neuroimaging studies, right? Like, what is the study design? What is the neuroimaging modality of choice? What is the method that we're using? Whether that's pre-processing of neuroimaging data or processing. What is the context? Is it a lab-based study? Is it resting states, or is it like a task-driven design? So again, through the practice of reflexivity, we should always like, what are my aims here, right? What are my goals here? What am I trying to achieve here? Because if I want to study psychedelic experiences, right, or meditative states, and I really understand that like not only cognition and experience is context dependent, right? It's constituted by, it's embedded, right? One of the E's and embodied. I would say that like these states are also hypersensitive to context, right? So they like their therapeutic transformative potential comes from this hypersensitivity to context. So when we take these people and we'll put them in this manufactured artificial environment in a fMRI, and they're having this experience, what am I doing to that person, right? What am I doing to their experience? What am I doing to their neural dynamics, right? How am I accounting for that? So one thing to do would be to be mindful of that context, right? To have a study design to counterbalance, so then you can have within-person design where people can have experiences in the lab and people can experiences in a context with mobile neuroimaging, and then you can compare like the similarities, the differences, and you can kind of see like what is the role of the context here, right? How the context like plays into the neural dynamics, the richness of like and the evolution of neural dynamics. You want to say something?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I'm failing to see the link, or you took it in a slightly different direction. But maybe just to clarify, like what, like we've established like that whole notion of context and assumptions, sure. But then what I meant was more like this philosophical assumption of the very causality of what it means, or like what, like when you're analyzing like a piece of neuroimaging data, and then when you're analyzing a certain outcome or a certain association with that data, like what bothers me the most is that neuroscience will always say like the brain is producing this, right? What I'm trying to get at is like, what can inactivist cognitive science use to try to dispel this assumption within neuroscience?
Yeah. Okay. I get you. I get you clear. So that's actually very relevant to the more recent work that I've been doing towards like, as I'm wrapping up my PhD, I'm thinking about like what's next. And me and Daniel Mailing with Michiel and Fred Hasselman, we are in the early stages of developing a proposal together. Let's see how that goes. But it's using complex systems tools and integrating them into neurophenomenology, right? And what is neurophenomenology? When Francisco Varela, who was, one of the initial proponents of the enactive approach, when he first proposed neurophenomenology, he proposed it as a remedy, not a solution to the hard problem of consciousness, right? Why did it choose that word? A remedy he drew from, it's like a Wittgensteinian, a philosophical remedy, right? It's not that like neurophenomenology will allow me to reach to a theory of consciousness and explain consciousness emerging from the brain. Or maybe it's idealistic, right? Like we can be kind of ontologically agnostic about that. But remedy is, no, I reject your presuppositions. I reject this kind of Cartesian internalist assumptions or ontology you bring to the table. And I just say, I'm not going to treat neural level as a privileged locus of causality, right? That is the physical locus, and somehow the mind emerges from it, right? Because it's rejecting the whole substance ontology, right? It's rejecting the whole substance metaphysic of saying that there is a physical stuff and a mental stuff in the first place. And really, neurophenomenology is about there is rich first-person experience derived from rigorous scientific methods, right? Like microphenomenology, right? And there is rich third-person data, quote-unquote third-person data, right? We can still say that third person is actually intersubjective, right? Because it's not really objective in that sense. Third-person data, whether that's neural data, physiological data, and then I can create a shared formalism, right? A bridging methodology. And his initial intention was dynamical systems formalism, right? Because he was grounded in that. He realized that inactive approach and complex dynamic systems share a lot of fundamental presuppositions that makes the mathematics of dynamical systems very fitting with inactive ontology. So then what we are doing in the practice of neurophenomenology is that we are describing mutual constraints, right? We're not trying to reduce, we're not trying to correlate, we're not trying to predict. We're saying there is this rich dynamic unfolding happening at the experiential level, right? It's valid. In a way, it's epistemically primary, right? Because it's really, this is the whole point of reflexivity, transcendentalism coming from Husserl, that we use consciousness to study consciousness. So you start from that, but then there's also this alternative description or perspective, the neural data, which also appears in experience, but it gives me a different perspective to the same phenomena, same holistic phenomena as it's unfolding. So I can use both these descriptions, and I can use them in a mutually constraining way, right? It's not one directional, you see. It's not that like this predicts that, or this correlates with that, or that emerges from this, or this explains that, right? I'm not trying to explain it. I'm just maintaining the circularity between the neural data and the first-person phenomenological data to inform my description of both in their full richness. So that's the inactive answer to neurocentrism, to neuroreductionism. Neurophenomenology, unfortunately, as I mentioned, because these attractor states of neuroreductionism is so deep that people still call it neurophenomenology because they have neural data and phenomenological data, but they're still just explaining phenomenological data with neural data. It's not about this circularity. It's still like one directional. So I am frustrated with that. I attended a workshop in Austrian Alps, computational neurophenomenology. It was wonderful, all young researchers, and it made me happy that even the most neuroreductionistic functionalist person was really open to this transcendental reflexive argument that we have to honor experience, right? We start from experience. There is no going outside of it. And that's really the core of Varela's vision when he proposed neurophenomenology, embracing that. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a great answer. And to me, that's actually quite surprising about the conference. Like, what did you say? Like computational neurophenomenology?
Computational neurophenomenology, young people, it's like a series. I had so many assumptions. I was like, oh, they're not going to see my point. I'm going to be isolated. And boy, I was glad that I was wrong. Like, it falsified all my assumptions. like people are so like young people like you and I, like just hungry. They're fed up with the old stuff. They're like when there's no figure looming over them, no supervisor, no established person, they can just be open. They can just be, let's do it differently. And it really made me happy, and it really encouraged me that like we are on the right path. We are really trying to do things differently here, which is just something beautiful to witness and be a part of.
Amazing. Awesome. All right. As a last section, I really wanted to get into a little bit of the rabbit hole that we got into last time in regards to truth and ground and meaning. And to some degree, I think these conversations are just fun, number one. So I think it's just cool to talk them over, and it might be interesting for people, but also maybe we can see if we can make some extra ground and kind of like unpack this a little bit better and make it a little bit more compatible. So I've been thinking really hard on how to do this. It's very difficult. So the way that I've decided to do it, and I don't know if this makes it easier or much harder, but maybe let's start with, how would you define truth or describe truth?
You went for it. How would you define truth, describe truth? Jesus. Hmm.
And you have 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you for that.
No, I'm joking. Take your time.
Okay. Thanks, man. At a deeper level, I hope this is clear, right? And I can't help but be influenced by 4P model and our work on that, and John's work, of course. In a way, truth for me, and we can talk about different kinds of truth, right? Propositional truth. Often people, when they think about truth, they do think about a truth statement, right? Like, do cats have 4 legs? True or false? But for me, truth is deeper than that. And for me, you can live truly. And I think that also is almost like you can live faithfully when there is this kind of deep commitment to a certain way of life, right? Whatever the tradition you commit to, right? Whatever the principles, the teachings, the guidepost of that tradition is, you do not merely utter them, you do not merely embrace them propositionally, but you give your life to them, right? You be true to them, you be faithful to them. And to me, when you participate in that faithfulness, I think that's a statement of truth. You embody truth in that way, right? Because you are experiencing it, you are becoming it, you are realizing it, and you are in communion with it. And so to me, that's my understanding of truth, right? Like when I see someone and they're being inauthentic, and I'm like, you're not being truthful. You're not. That's fake. That's fake. And this is not a judgment, right? We are all fake at one point or another, right? Like, life is hard. We run into roadblocks, and it becomes sometimes easier to deceive ourselves. It's so easy with the minds that we have. But I think the enterprise of wisdom, like the project of wisdom, the contemplative project, is really cultivating truth in this sense, just being more and more and more truthful to yourself, and to people around you. So that would be what I would say.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that is a really good way to put it, and I agree with a lot of that. And also, I think this is a really good way to think about older traditions and older ways of living. I don't want to oversimplify it, but at the very least, it did have a very large element of this sense of like actually following through with something, right? Rather than being correct. And you see this obviously in a lot of religious traditions, right? So following the way, right? It's kind of and being sticking true to that. Now, the problem that I have with this, or maybe not a problem, but just a consideration that pops into my mind, is that the way that you framed it is very much around this notion of authenticity, right? Now, and again, sorry to always bring Heidegger, but I've been revising him a lot, so that's always what pops the most to my mind is. But this is a lot of what I see with Heidegger as well. Like he talks about like it over and over again about this notion of authenticity, and it's like, okay, sure, and that makes a lot of sense, and it's very important for this notion of agency, right? It's kind of like, the decisions come from my own, and I'm not losing my agency towards something external, and also my ways of being are aligned, right? What I do in the world is actually aligned with the way that I want to live. So there's all these notions of kind of alignment. The problem, I think, with thinking of truth this way is that it's very much this notion of corresponding to something. Like it's the notion of faithfulness, right? So it's closing the gap. The problem, in my opinion, is like, what are you closing to? And this is again the issue that you see on Heidegger all the time. Like, he talks about all this talk about authenticity, and then he never gives you any framework whatsoever to actually pursue the real, right? To know, to have a sense of normativity towards the endless possibilities to that which you can be faithful. So how do you try to take this into account, or how would you respond to that within your perspective of how you're framing truth?
I mean, I think with Heidegger, and also like, like I always, when I'm attracted to the work of someone, their ideas, I can't help but also look at them and try to understand them as people, right? Like what brought these ideas forward, right? Who is this person? And with Heidegger, clearly brilliant, but also very problematic person, right? Problematic, and of course we can separate the ideas from the people, right? The art from the artist, let's say, to some extent. But to me, that this also again kind of shows the emphasis on the language of description versus language of training, right? Like to me, like he is developing this impressive kind of network of ideas, this perspective, but he doesn't seem so interested, and correct me if I'm wrong, he doesn't so interested in the implementation of this, in the embodiment, in the embracement of this, right? And this was also one of the critique in the embodied mind by Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche of Husserlian phenomenology, and even Merleau-Ponty, right? They derive some ideas from phenomenology, which of course Heidegger follows from or is a student of, but they thought this is not practical. This is a lot of theoretical stuff, a lot of bells and whistles, but how do we apply this? So that's why they decided to go the Abhidharma way, the Madhyamaka way, because they thought the Buddhist traditions really put so much emphasis in this non-propositional kind of knowing, in this language of training. And of course, they admitted that they were wrong. Husserl in his later work, in The Crisis of European Sciences, and Merleau-Ponty very much attempts to also put the money where their mouth is, and like walk the walk too, right? Like to kind of like come up with like the language of training. But I don't know, and I don't know Heidegger as much. I don't know if Heidegger sufficiently attempts that or realizes that. I think, yeah, as you said, he talks about authenticity at length, but he never talks about like, but how do you do that? How do you resonate? How do you conform to the real, right? How do you live a good life?
Yeah, sorry, just to introduce a little bit of a clarification. Like, obviously, I'm also not like what I was trying to do is more like give an example with kind of like a grammar that was more on top of my mind to try to clarify it a little bit. But obviously, the concern here isn't Heidegger per se, right? Like, I was using Heidegger as kind of like, a useful, even if an imprecise proxy for this kind of way of thinking, right? So yeah, I understand this notion of practice, but then the issue is, okay, regardless of practice, which I would definitely agree with you that there's a gigantic gap there, right? But even with your own framework, which is more what I'm concerned about, is like, and also for some context of the listeners, maybe this is a bit confusing for people listening. Like, the reason why we're trying to unpack some of these stuff is because we think about truth and what the ultimate grounding of things are, and then we had a discussion where we're trying to unpack some of these things and kind of reconcile some of the differences, and that's kind of what we're trying here to bring to the discussion. So, but what I was trying to figure out is, regardless of Heidegger, beyond the example, is like, how do you, regardless of the practice, before we get to the practice, you need to have a name, right, to be faithful to. That is more my primary concern, is like, how do you know that? Because that is what I totally agree with your perspective on truth, but at the same time, that is what we mean by true as well, right? It's not because you can't be you can't say that it's true if you're faithful to something that's completely arbitrary.
That's a good point. To me, that again, it kind of comes to ethical know-how. Varela talks about this. There's a small book that he published before he passed on ethical know-how. So this has been my experience so far. You know, like it's so hard to kind of convince people with merely propositional, quote unquote, rational argumentation, right? And convince them to let go of their cherished beliefs about the world, right? Cherish certain truths about the world and embody or shift to a different perspective, right? You can't, propositions will only get you so far. They can be helpful, but they will only get you so far. So in my experience, what really is powerful is that, okay, like, before I even get to the practice, how do I decide that this is truth, right? This is truth in its most authentic manifestation or expression, right? How do I do that? And there is no easy answer. For me, it's really comes to ethical know-how, right? Like I would say be patient, and that's a privilege that not everyone has, right? People suffer, they want answers, they want remedy, right? To their pain, but rushing won't really help. And I think the most kind of the wisest approach would be stick with someone, watch the right. If you meet a teacher, right? If you meet a teacher, if you're doing it through a teacher, or you're doing it, and a lot of Western people do it, right? Eclectically, right? Like it's like you're autodidact, right? And I think we both, to some extent, kind of embody that or exemplify that. How do I know that like the traditions I'm drawing from are actually virtuous traditions, right? They're actually like really virtuous manifestations or authentic manifestations of truth. For me, I look at the people. I look at the representations, right? I look at like how do these people carry themselves? How do these people embody the ideas or the traditions they purport to represent, right? How do they touch other people's life? Because to me, and this is something John said that stuck with me, when we talk about enlightenment, right? Awakening, an awakened person, not necessarily a fully awakened, but like a sage, a wise person, it eases the suffering of everyone around them, right? Like when I see a sage in action, that is an embodiment, a representation of a tradition, right? I embody the Dharma, right? I embody the Buddha, the Buddha nature. Then necessarily when I'm living my life, right, I should embody those values that come with it, right? Like, well, I should like, look at the friends, look at the people around that person, right? Like, look at the community. How do they live their lives, right? Do they live their lives in a virtuous way? Are they kind people? Are they compassionate? People with gratitude. And this is hard, right? Like people are so it's very hard to deceive ourselves, especially when we are in need of community, in need of belonging, in search for truth. And I think as scientists, as cognitive scientists, as philosophers, some of our work really should be towards that we can help people and develop tools and develop guidelines to guide people in this search, right? That like I can use the best of science, I can use the best of contemplative traditions in a dialogue, in this mutual constraint, and I can help people in guiding them, right? So they can find their home, they can recover their home again, right? They can see the God for the first time again, as John likes to say. And it's going to be unique for everyone, right? Some people will be like, they'll go into a psychedelic circle and be like, it's too much woo. And the others will go as like, oh, this is my jam. I love these people here, right? So it's really like we need to kind of come up with these, and I think that's what John is trying to do with his philosophical Silk Road, right? Like, let me lay down this road so people can travel on this. It makes it easier, so they can either find the home or they can recover what they had missed, right? For me, for example, I grew up in an Islamic context. I was never a Muslim. I've never been a Muslim. I was very secular, but I had the psychedelic experiences that turned me on to contemplative traditions, Buddhist practices mainly, and now I'm recovering Sufi Islam, through Sufi context. And I'm like, oh wow, it was right there, but it was so much bullshit that I just didn't have access to it. Now I can recover that because of of work that is being done by people like John, right? So to me, that's why I like to work with John, because to me he really embodies. He tries his best to embody these, right? It's not just like talk. He really walks the walk, and I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So that would be my answer. Yeah.
Yeah, that was fantastic, and I agree with a lot of that. Now, one of the issues that I'd just like to maybe try to expand on is when you say, this ethical know-how that is non-propositional. Obviously, I agree with a lot of that, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense. I think for most people, even if they're not very attuned to this type of more philosophical discussions. But one of the issues that we were getting a little bit stuck on last time was this notion of grounds, right? This notion of like if you keep looking deeper and deeper into it, like, is there going to be something behind it or not? And one of the reasons that I was trying to frame these questions in the beginning in this way is to also try to arrive at that, to kind of like get at the metaphysical, but at the same time, like starting from personal experience. And how you framed it in terms of like this ethical know-how, it's like, yeah, okay, you can say that it's non-propositional, but then at the same time, what I'm also more interested in is, okay, are we considering to be this real standards that I'm looking for, right? Because one issue is like the epistemology of it. It's like, how can I know? But there's another issue of like, is there something to know? Does this exist or does not exist? And so if you say, okay, I'm going to look at these sages and then I'm going to make this judgment, right? That is admitting that there's this underlying thing underneath that you're then looking for. Does this person conform to this thing that I'm trying to chase, right? And so from your perspective, and given your how much you've been influenced by Buddhist epistemology and metaphysics, how do you try to make sense of that within this claim that ultimately there's no ground?
Yeah, another great question. So as you said, yeah, I'm deeply influenced by Buddhists, especially. I mean, I don't want to say like Buddhist because it's not a monolith. There's so much diversity. There's idealist strains of Buddhist schools. There are materialist teaching lineages of Buddhist traditions. For me, I very much am attracted to Madhyamaka, which is, it's relational through and through. And it's not the only relational tradition, right? I think John's work very much is an attestment to that. The reason he defines himself as a Zen Neoplatonist is where you see that kind of relational through line in also like other Western traditions and other Eastern traditions too, in Taoism as well, and in Advaita Vedanta also, in certain understandings. In that, right, reality is groundless. Our self is groundless and the world is groundless. What does that mean? The reality is empty, but it's not, it's empty of intrinsic existence, right? Meaning that it's there are no things, right? The self is not a thing and the world is not a thing. There is no ultimate thing, ultimately intrinsically existing independent thing. Substance ontologies usually understand reality in terms of things, right? And God becomes the ultimate thing, the most independent, the most standalone. From a relational perspective, I would say I would still hold on to an understanding or find it defensible, the possibility for the ultimate, right? The sacred, a God or the God. But it's not a thing, right? When we talk about reality, we say it's real, but it's empty, right? Meaning that it's um it's indefinite. It's no thing, right? Because saying that it's empty does that mean nothing, right? Saying that empty is it's no thing. It's potentiality. So to me, the ultimate nature of reality, the ultimate quote unquote source of truth, is not a ground, right? It's not a metaphysical base level. A lot of kind of spatial metaphors come into this because of our our perception, of course, as human beings. But to me, this this truth, right? This faithfulness, right? It's not it's not necessarily conforming to an unchanging, independent, ultimate thing, whatever you want to call that, or God, or truth, or the sacred, but it's more like there's an organizational, organizing principle to world, to existence, to reality, right? It suffuses me, it gives me life, it suffuses you, it suffuses everything, right? The closest thing is like Spinoza came closest to this, like kind of like a panentheism, where it's transcendent, right? Because it's not a thing among things, it's not an object among object, but it's also immanent because it's right here. It structures everything, it gives lives to everything, it organizes everything, right? Even saying it to it, it reifies it, right? Like because it's not a thing. It's more like it's a cosmic play, right? And we are just players of this play. And it's just playing itself with all these different players. And to me, truth is realizing that I'm a player in this cosmic play and being true to that player, to that play, whatever shape or form it takes, right? That's the pain, that's the beauty, that's the love, that's the joy, whatever shape it takes. I be true to it. I just accept it. Because what am I gonna do? Like, just should raise my hands and say, "Oh, it's not fair." It's doing its thing, and that doesn't mean that we have no free will, right? It just means that we are here right now as real players, right? And what we do here right now, because if I'm a good person, right, I can lead a good life and I can have impact in the world and I can ease the real suffering of the other people. But that doesn't necessitate that these actions or the suffering needs to be grounded in an ultimate kind of metaphysical ground, right?
But if you're willing to concede agency, and if you're willing to concede that the suffering is real and that the love is real, if it is both real and self-generated, then why use the metaphor of play?
That's a good question. That's why I said like it's kind of it's playing itself, and in a way, and some people have talked about this. In order to be creative, in order to be the potentiality that it needs to be, that it can help but be, right? This logos, let's call it logos as a space filler, right? Or the Dharmakaya, right? Like let's call it logos for just logos. It goes through this kind of amnesia, right? Like it's like it embodies itself in life in ever complex patterns and forms, right? But it's not the puppet master, right? It's not itself controlling everything. The controlling head, the play is just organically evolving. It's unfolding in real time. It's an open-ended participatory process, right? I need to be a participant. You need to be a participant. The world needs to be a participant for this unfolding to take place, right? If I'm not a participant, it's not gonna realize its potential, right? So to me, it's kind of like a compatibilist understanding of free will and agency, right? It's not because it's interdependent, right? My agency is not transcendent, it's not independent. There are degrees of freedom to it, right? I can do that instead of this, but ultimately my freedom, Hans Jonas said this, I love this. My freedom is a needful freedom. I see, like you see, like on account of its organization, its agency is a needful agency. I need the world. I need the energy and the matter to maintain myself, to make myself anew, right? As social beings, I need you. I need other people to, existentially exist. But also, I have a say in this, right? I have a capacity to explore those degrees of freedom. But it's not boundless. It's not limitless, right? So it's that, again, it's that middle ground. Yeah, between like anything goes and nothing matters.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's try not let's try not to get into compatibilism, because that makes no sense in my head. So like
Okay.
I think that would
Next
be
time.
a very big
Next time.
rabbit hole. But okay, maybe let's try. Okay, so this logos you spoke of, like you see this as Maybe this is already oversimplifying and misrepresenting it. So let me know if it is the case, but it's my best first intuition. Like, do you view it more so as the structuring of reality, which sometimes is spoken of, or more like an unfolding of reality in history with like a purpose of some kind?
Amazing question again. The latter one more so, but let me caveat that, right? I do not. So this is not like a Hegelian argument, right? To me, if there is a teleology to the unfolding of reality, the open-endedness of it, it's creation itself, right? It can help. Spinoza uses this word conatus, right? Reality has potentiality. It can help but create. It can help but drive itself for ever greater complexity. Is there an endpoint to that? I don't know. I don't think so. Right? It's this whole like overused thing, like the journey is the destination, right? Where it's really it's the path as it's unfolding. That's the whole purpose of it, right? Unfolding is the purpose. Doing is the purpose. History, time, space emerges in this unfolding, right?
But then how do you connect that notion of creation, of multiplicity, of growth, of complexity with virtue? Because you could have like this metaphysical worldview where and you actually see this quite a lot in New Age as well. Like, people often say those types of ideas, okay, but you could do that and have love becoming absolutely 100% irrelevant.
In Buddhist contexts, in certain Buddhist contexts, critiques of Madhyamaka also talk about this. We can kind of go back and kind of take this perspective of true truth analysis, right? Some people talk about this, and I see their point. I'm not sure where I stand fully, right? At the conventional level, right, where reality is it's real but it's empty, all of this matters, right? This all matters because we are living here, we are flesh and blood, our actions matter, we want to do good in the world, our suffering matters, our love matters. But at the ultimate level, there is no distinction between pain and pleasure, right? There is no distinction between love and hate. And that's a big pill for me to swallow, right? So there's also in me, I find this kind of transcendental inclination that like we even holding on to this kind of relational groundless understanding, right? This picture, we can still hold on to a broader understanding of love. It's just not our we talked about this last time. It's just not our human understanding of love, right? It's this cosmic love that is about creation itself. And even when you're suffering, even when the most horrendous shit is happening, it's always fucking there. And it's not, you won't be able to conform it. You won't be able to justify it with our human morality. You just won't be able to. And that's what makes it transcendental in some way.
I mean, I realize these things are complicated, so but whatever. We just have to simplify it. But like with this simplification into account, but isn't a large part of the claim of groundlessness precisely to deny this perspective of transcendence?
Not necessarily. I mean, we can talk about a certain understanding of transcendent or transcendence, and John talks about that too, where transcendence is not like Kantian noumena, right? Like it's not the thing in itself. It's not the ultimate thing that all reality derives from, but ultimately is unknowable or unreachable. To me, it's transcendent because it transcends phenomena, right? It's grounds phenomena. It makes possible phenomena or phenomenality in the first place, right? That's why I call it transcendent, because in the act of grasping, you find that you cannot grasp it, right?
But this is what I get so confused. But like, isn't that an epistemological point? Right? It's like, okay, like you can't know it, but that's not the ultimate concern. The ultimate concern is, does it exist? Does it exist in the ultimate sense?
No, it doesn't. Not a thing like it exists because we participate. Can I say this? Maybe it will clarify. This came up in the workshop, if you can believe it. It was so amazing that we get to talk about this. There was a convergence, and it brings like quantum mechanics, cubism in quantum mechanics, right? That when you understand reality, um, in this indefinite, open-ended, processual, relational way, right? What this entails is it entails a participatory epistemology, right? That we are active participants in actualizing that potential. The reality is the no-thingness of it all, it's the potential itself, and we actualize it into existence as such, into objects, right? Into things, right? We are the actualizers, right? We are the players in the play. We actualize the play, we enact the play, right? Um, but what that means for reality in terms of ontology is that when you take a when you take a participatory epistemology, that goes hand in hand with a relational ontology, which goes hand in hand with this kind of ethical know-how, right? And Karen Barad, in her work Meeting the Universe Halfway, she uses this term ethical and onto epistemology, right? When you understand reality like this, knowing, doing, and being are like that. You can't separate them. That's why, like participatory knowing, we refer to it as knowing by being, right? When you have that participatory realization, you realize that knower and the known are not separate. They have never been separate. That separation was always conventional, always empty, right? By knowing, I become. By knowing, being emerges. By knowing, I do good in the world, right? And vice versa. Like all this separation between epistemology, ethics, and ontology is really conventional at some sense too. So I don't know if that answers your question, or maybe more questions emerge out of it.
No, that is helpful. I'm just trying to think how to pick it from here. But another, I mean, this is not a direct reply, I suppose, but maybe it still helps to clarify, which is, I think a dilemma that you usually get a little bit stuck on as well is that you have this notion of, okay, this relationship that is, between object and subject, let's say, or between kind of like first person perspective and kind of like this transcendent thing that is happening, and like aligning yourself with it. But then I think the path that you sometimes take is also like that is true, right? And you want to say that, like, you want to say that's fake, but also at the same time you say, but it's just, but it's ultimately like not a thing. One of the areas that I struggle with is also that, precisely because, and maybe this comes back to the same point, I don't even know, my brain is mush right now, but like, um but when you take this kind of like inactivist participatory framework, which I fully agree with, to me what that means is that there's nothing behind it, because reality as such doesn't exist. But if that's the case, then the fact of looking behind also loses its meaning. And therefore, the step before looking behind is what you are looking at. And therefore, that's the ultimate ground.
Yeah. Um, that's a good question. I mean, what do you mean by looking? Like these kind of metaphors, right? Like Husserl, for example, I can't remember the German word, but he talks about experience as like ungo behindable, right? That's ultimate epistemically, right? Epistemically, and this is very much an inactive perspective. This comes through very clearly in the Blind Spot book by Evan Thompson and his co-authors, that consciousness is epistemically primary, right? There is not you can even say like, but what about participatory knowing, right? I mean, that is experience, and you can maybe that you can go beyond experience. And I would say not necessarily. I think it's experiential, but experiential in a non-dual sense, right? It's just experience without the experiencer and the object of experience, right? Let's not go there for now. What I'm trying to say here is that epistemically consciousness is primary. That's a given. We can actually make that inference, right? That's really valid. Like it's quite like reasonable to make that inference. But to go and say there is a world out there, that's an assumption, right? And I would say ultimately all of this is an assumption. What Madhyamaka does is that it says, okay, I agree with you that consciousness comes first epistemologically, right? That's the premise of consciousness. But then when I use certain practices and certain tools, and I look at the structural invariance of my experience, right? What really remains at the bare naked truth of experience as such, existence as such, I realize that this experience is groundless, right? That like there is no ground seed, like there is no ultimate subject, there is no ultimate object. Some people would even say that there is also not like that would be the idealist claim. So there is like a Madhyamaka idealist threads where like, oh, this entails idealism, that like ultimately everything is mental. But I want to resist that. And I would suggest that, our experience is also necessarily embodied, right? It's not that our experience is like floating there in the abstract realm and it's disembodied, right? Even though when we had out of body experiences, that's more of an altered embodiment than out of body, right? So you look at this like codependent primacy, right? That you start from experience, right? But then you follow it and then you find that you're also embodied, right? And then you really cannot, it's like a Mobius strip. You cannot unfold it. You cannot break that loop. So to me, and I agree with you, it's always a step, it's always a leap into faith. But having these kinds of experiences and kind of philosophically propositional or reflecting on them, it becomes very kind of attractive or convincing in a way. But also, ultimately, the most important thing is this, right? If you really embrace emptiness, it becomes that like it's the ethical know-how, right? Like if you believe in a God in substantial terms, and that affords you that you live a good life, I that's good. Like that's true, right? Like it's not like less than in any way, right? I think to me, emptiness is really this reflexivity that I realize that like I am the active participant, and whether that's true or not in an ultimate sense, it's not relevant here. It's really not relevant here. Like I can do good in this world, the holding on to this, right? And if it's not useful anymore, I can let it go. That's the liberating kind of soteriological aspect of it. That I don't have to commit to a thing and then like run the risk of reifying or grasping.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was beautifully put. And there's so much that we could
So much. Yeah.
continue from that. And I always like the thing that I love so much about talking with you is that I always get this feeling of like that I can't quite get there. Like I can't quite resolve it in this ultimate sense. But it's only because I just don't know enough and I'm just too stupid. But I'm almost there. And if I only knew more and if only I was slightly smarter, I could just solve it like right
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
Um
But I appreciate. I mean, that I think is like the right kind of. I feel that all the time. That's the humility of it. That makes you open, right? I think that's the whole point. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Awesome. So I know you have to go soon, so we're going to wrap it up. Just as a last question. So one of the things that I think a lot to myself, especially in relationship to my own work and everything that I do, is I feel like I was very stupid when I was younger, and I think one of the reasons why I was so stupid was because it was a natural outcome of my worldview and my understanding of how reality worked at the time. And I'm particularly bothered by how that made me suffer, how I caused suffering in others, and so on. And given that context, something that always comes to mind is if I manage to travel back in time, how would I convince my older self to stop being so stupid? Why that worldview just doesn't work? And how could I do that in like a very condensed, like brief version of it, right? Like not in the sense of like you time travel and then you're like, okay, we're gonna have a 30-hour, lecture on everything, right? So, and I think this exercise is really helpful as well. And this is how I frame my own work, is that in the same way that I could travel back in time to try to advise, that person, which is me, I can do the exact same thing and have the exact same benefit to other people that are in similar context to where I was, right? So, so given this, like, how would you approach that thought experiment, right? So, like, if you went back to, I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15, whatever it may be, and if you feel like you lacked wisdom, how could you, in the most condensed form possible, try to give that wisdom?
I love that question. Really nice. It reminds me of like what John says. No, as child is to an adult is to the sage, right? And yeah, children are stupid. I was so stupid. I was so foolish. I look back and I feel shame, and necessarily so. And then I realized that was needed, right? Like I needed to go through that. I needed to suffer. I needed to bring suffering to people I care about, and I was able to learn from that. And because of that, I transform. Right? It's like the end of Shawshank Redemption, where like he crawls through the shit and he comes out and he's just clean, right? That crawling through shit, you can't change that. Like you really need, like we need that. That's the liminality. That's the destabilization, right? But still, I couldn't, if I traveled back in time, right? And I was just, I'm me now. I couldn't help but approach my younger self with compassion and understanding. And I think what would be the best way is, like maybe what I mentioned early on. First, I would think it's fine. Go through this. You're gonna be fine. You need to go through this. It's okay. I'm not going to intervene here. I don't know how that will turn out. Or if I had enough time, right? If I could stay there in that time period for longer, I would just try to be the best role model I can be. Again, what I said earlier, right? Like it's that ethical know-how. Like if I can live my life in a way, in a truthful way, and this stupid kid can just look up to me as he look up to all the other people, and he's still looking up to, right? Then maybe I could contribute to that in a way, right? Or maybe it's just my hubris that I think that I'm so grown and so wise now that I go and I mess up and I end up like, actually I turned back and then the time has changed and I'm a piece of shit now, you know? I wasn't the best role model. So it's hard to tell. But I mean, I don't know. I think knowing myself, I would try to approach myself with that kind of compassion and just try to be a good role model, try to nourish the best parts of myself, the wonder and the kind of stepping away from like people pleasing and just doing good for the sake of good, right? Not to like cover up any insecurities. So yeah, that's what I would do.
Amazing, wonderful. Thanks a lot for that. Is there anything else that you want to say, or do you want to point people to something that you're doing or that's coming out?
I mean, we covered everything. I don't have that much out there yet. So if people are interested, they can take a look at the paper. If they have thoughts, they can contact me. My email would be somewhere on the paper. And yeah, hopefully, more empirical work will come out, and I will try to, with the people I'm working with John, with Daniel, that are just, yeah, such amazing role models that just keep inspiring me every day, that I hope I don't disappoint them, and I don't disappoint my commitment to authenticity, and embrace this what I'm saying, right? And embody them, all this reflexivity and stuff. But yeah, I think we covered a lot, and yeah, this was such a joy. I really enjoy always like talking to you. So yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, likewise. So yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and thank you for the wonderful conversation. And yeah, hope we can talk again soon.